Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so glad that you'll be able to be with us as we go through some quick tips to ensure collaborative IEP and 504 meetings. Today, we have with us Lee Patterson, who is a school psychologist with the Charleston County School District. Lee is also a mother of two, and one of her children has a 504 plan. My name is Melissa Sanders, and I'm the Director of Training with Family Connection. And I also have two kids, and one of mine has an IEP. And so I think that we're going to have a fabulous conversation today. I hope that everyone viewing learns a lot. I know that I'm looking forward to learning a lot. So looking forward to learning professionally, but also personally for my own house. So thank you so much. And thank you, Lee, for joining us today. I really
Thank
appreciate it.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, Lee, if you could give us just some things that schools can do, as where everyone's preparing, the parents prepare on their end for IEPs and 504s, and schools also prepare for IEPs and 504s before those meetings.
Mhm.
So, what are some things that schools can do to help parents be better prepared for their 504 or IEP meeting?
Yeah, what I try to talk to with my colleagues when I've been in different positions is always to understand that it's so difficult for parents. It's difficult for them to hear repeatedly that their child is struggling, even if they're
Mhm.
making progress, because we still have to talk about they're making progress, but this is where they still need some supports. Um, so I try to, talk with my colleagues about understanding and having empathy for the parents coming in. Um, and in my experience, the single best thing that the schools can do is build relationships with the parents.
Mhm.
And that starts with your very first phone call to them, whether it's to set up the referral meeting, if it's to do a triennial reevaluation. What I do is always just talk with the parent, try to give them an explanation of why we're meeting, even if they know it, but to remind them. And then I just try to get some information from them, like what do you think's going well at school? What do you feel like is not going well? And that begins kind of giving them a foundation for trust that you're going to hear what they have to say. And it also, when you do that, schools have an idea of what the parents might be concerned about. So when you come into the meeting to go over, whatever it is, reevaluation, IEP, whatever, you can come in with some possible solutions to what that parent has expressed over the phone. There may be some more concerns that are raised. You might not, get everything accomplished at that meeting, but you've heard them and you're going to meet it. The other thing, and I hate to be long-winded about it, but it is something I'm passionate about. I really feel like school teams should be knowledgeable about students' strengths and needs prior to the meeting. And obviously, that's part of the law, it's part of what we do, but to really have a really good, deep understanding of it. Historically, what has this child struggled with? What are some, I just always try to think in advance, what are some things that the parent might be concerned with? Oh gosh, they're not doing well in math. Let me call that math teacher and see what happened. Because sometimes it could be the teacher didn't enter in a grade and simple fix. Sometimes
Mhm.
you may find that the child's passing everything except those big cumulative exams. And so that really talks to you about, okay, and obviously talks to me because I'm thinking it in my mind, but it talks to me about, do we need to look at chunking?
Mhm.
What do we need to do for this student? But it already kind of gets the wheels going and thinking about what are some things that might come up at this meeting and how can I help? So I think when you come in prepared, you come in with some ideas, you're already going in and laying the groundwork for a more productive meeting. And it also builds parents' confidence that you're going to address their child's needs. They're not always having to tell you when there's a problem. You're
Mhm.
problem solving, saying, "Hey, I noticed this."
Well, and
Um,
Lee, I will mention just as a parent, it's reassuring to me whenever the school says or the teacher says, I've noticed this and I'm wondering how we might be able to work on that. Because that tells me that, hey, my kid matters to you and you're thinking about my child. You're actively, proactively trying to figure out how to help my kid. And that means a lot as a parent.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that's a very, very good point. That and the whenever you mentioned about building relationships, that having that ahead of time can be helpful whenever you come into that meeting.
And I think it often helps when you have hard times, and let's admit it, you're going to.
Right.
It just happens, and our kids, you know, they're our heart, and no matter what happens, those parents are, devastated, as I was as a parent. Um, devastated when they're not doing well, when they're not meeting a certain expectation, or when they're upset because they perceive themselves as not doing well. So if you have someone that you've already had a relationship with, that has listened to you in the past, that can really get you through some pretty tough times.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I think that's a very good point. Um, so we talked some about some things that schools can do to help parents be better prepared. What are some things that parents can do before the meeting, whether it's a 504, an IEP, you know, plan to evaluate whatever the meeting is, that could maybe enable the school to address some concerns?
So, I look at this from my lens of working with parents, but also me as a parent. Um, Sometimes as a parent, I feel like they don't want to hear from me again. You know, and I'm not saying that that is the case always. Sometimes it's my feeling, my
Right.
perception. Um, but the biggest thing I would say eh, is don't wait until you're at a boiling point to speak with a team member or request a meeting,
Mhm.
because you're never a bother to anybody. Even if you feel that, you got to kind of push that aside and just contact them, because once you get to that boiling point, and it's really hard to trust again. It's hard to have that relationship, and they're the ones that are going to be working with their child. The other thing that I personally do, and I like it when parents do it, is write down the topics that you want to talk about. Because when you go in, just like a school may have an agenda, you have an agenda as well. And so when you leave, you haven't forgotten anything. All your concerns have been addressed. And if you feel comfortable as a parent and you feel confident in the team, I would share those topics with the team prior to the meeting. So, again, that they might be able to brainstorm a few things. Of course, they're not going to predetermine it or anything, but it allows them some time to say, okay, didn't know this was going on. Let me see if, we can come up with some ideas for when we get into this meeting. And then, when appropriate, I would say for parents, it's often very difficult for school teams to get outside reports. It takes a long time to get information from doctors. HIPAA is fantastic, it protects your child's information. But for example, I work a lot with the Medical University of South Carolina. So my release of information, which is FERPA compliant, isn't HIPAA compliant. So I have to use MUSC's release of information, but they often change it and they don't always tell us.
Hmm.
And So sometimes it can also take a couple months to get information from them because they have so many requests. So that's another thing, like any kind of new diagnosis, new report, if you could provide a copy of that, because sometimes we can't get it quickly. And the other thing is when we're working with students and we hear that there's a diagnosis, we still have to have verification. And as a school team member, it's not to be difficult. It truly is because it's one of the criteria that we need. So that really helps the process as well.
Mhm. Well, and I think that's a good point with providing that report ahead of time, because then that way folks can read it before they get to the meeting rather than, either not reading it or having to spend valuable meeting time reading this long report whenever you could have read it before.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll tell you, like when if somebody brings me a report to the meeting, like you're saying, I will not be able to read it and synthesize that information well, in a short period of time, because you're really saying, okay, what does this report say? What do I know about this child here? And it's not to discredit it, but you're trying to synthesize information to feel like, okay, what supports do we have based on this information? These are the recommendations. How does that look here? So like you're saying, it helps to speed up that process.
Right. Make it all more efficient. You know?
Yes. Mhm.
Well, and I like your idea of writing the topics or writing your questions down before you get to the meeting. Because I know for me, sometimes I forget, or the conversation kind of goes sideways, and then I leave and I realize, oh, I forgot to ask them about bus transportation, or I forgot, So, whereas, if I had let them know ahead of time, hey, I'm interested in bus transportation, maybe the school could already talk to the transportation office and have an answer by the time we got into the meeting if something was possible or not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm. Um, so what are some important things for schools to remember and do whenever they are conducting 504 meetings or IEP meetings that would better meet the needs of parents?
So I touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to say it again because I feel like it's so important for school team members to know it. Um, you know, some people naturally know it, and they have this empathy. Some people know it because they've had a child with it, or they
Mhm.
have a child with disability or a family member. But I think we forget, as school team members, that we have an expertise. I went to school for 7 years to do this, and so I have a lot of information. And because I've been doing it so long, it doesn't seem so special.
Mhm.
Um, but it's really scary and confusing to people that don't do it every day. And it doesn't matter what the background of the parents is. So my husband, he'll come to 504 meetings with me. We've been married before I started graduate school. He's been with me this whole time. He knows a lot about special education. And when we go to the 504 meeting, I always ask his thoughts after the meeting. And he's a vice president of the Southeast, real fancy title, all that. And I'll say, what did you think? And he said, I didn't understand a word.
Mhm.
And that always just hurts my heart to think how many times have I let a parent walk out and feel like they didn't understand something.
Mhm.
What I would say is, you know, you've got to talk with the parents in a way that they can understand. Make it so that when they walk out, you have used terms that are friendly. You're asking them questions throughout. Be kind, obviously, be professional, but allow the parents to speak during the process. Don't do the big data dump, or don't say like, you've been to these meetings before, because just because they have went to one last year doesn't mean that they are like, "Oh, yes, I'm a pro at this." Some parents are. Don't get me wrong. I've got parents that are, can probably explain data better than I can, but that's not the norm. So I would say what I try to do is I stop and ask the parent along the way if they have questions. The other thing that I really try to do is watch nonverbal signs for parents. If they kind of furrow their brow, or you kind of see like an increased agitation, or they kind of look off like they're trying to think of something, I just stop and just say, do you want me to re-explain that, or did you have a question about that? Because the more you just keep going over what you've written, the madder they get, or they're not even hearing what you're saying because they're still thinking about, hey, what does she even mean by that? So I, I use data, but I definitely try to explain the information in a way that helps the parent when they leave there to work with their child or understand their child or be able to explain it to family members or later meetings, be able to understand that. And so just to end this, some parents do have that deep knowledge, but you can't assume it. I don't think any meeting that we have for kids should ever become kind of, oh, we do this all the time, because it's just not all the time for our parents. I meet with parents once every 3 years once they're identified, and usually not more frequently. So it shouldn't become something that I'm that's not special. Give them that time, give them that space to understand it, and allow them to ask questions.
Mhm. What do you recommend to parents if they are in a meeting and they feel like it is going kind of like how you're describing, kind of this is what we're doing. We've got to do this annual review by this date, or we need to look at this by this date. What do what would be your recommendation to a parent on maybe what they could say or questions they could ask to kind of change the tone or approach of that a little bit?
So, it's one of those things that's hard. It's hard as a professional to see it happen, and it's
Mhm.
hard as a parent when it happens to you. Um, Usually what I try to do is just say, I have the school will generally have introductions. They start the meeting, they kind of have a process.
Mhm.
Once they do that, I usually will stop and say, I just have something that I want to say. I generally that way I have a voice,
Mhm.
and I'm a parent that's educated in this, so I don't feel uncomfortable doing it. And I'll just say, I just want to acknowledge or thank, and I'll identify teachers that have really gone above and beyond. And
Mhm.
then I'll say, the reason we're meeting today is not just because it's an annual, it's also because we've got to look at what changes need to be made based on their progress. And so I kind of set the stage and say, so I'm really excited about a good conversation about how she's doing and if there's anything that we need to do differently.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's really how I try to do it. Um,
Right. Well, I
and
like that because then it is more, it's not so much you, the parent, or like the consumer and it's being spoken at you, but it is more conversational. It is more we're all participants in this, not just kind of a one-way conversation.
for sure.
Yeah. Um, what would be some strategies that you have maybe seen or that you would recommend for handling whenever there are disagreements? Because sometimes things go great, and then other times, you kind of get those bumpy spots. So what are some strategies that you would recommend?
So I'm going to confess that I have been the parent that has not been kind. I have been the parent that has been angry, not in general, but about
Mhm,
something specific that has occurred.
mhm,
Um, and I let them know it. And sometimes I'm been angrier because I'm hurt, I'm frustrated. So I think that kind of is nice for other parents to know. I feel like sometimes I'm not being heard, and they know full well what I do for a living. And so the thing is, for parents to understand is sometimes folks aren't doing it on purpose. They're trying to kind of meet a need. They're trying to get through it the best they can. And so I will tell you some strategies, but as people, we're human and we don't always employ them, but we always strive to.
mhm,
So I would just say forgive yourself whenever you don't shine and you don't handle it as well as you wish you had, because it's okay. And
happens. Mhm,
yeah, I would say for schools, not so much the parents, but for schools, what I try to talk to my colleagues about is first and foremost, they have to suspend judgment. That's one of the biggest things I see is judgment of the parent, um, their parenting style, their expectations. And we all know we're so different. We all have different belief systems, but we also have different circumstances. And those are things that are outside of our control. But what's in our control is to be kind, to be professional, and try to understand where the parent's coming from. So I always look at it from a standpoint of I'm a professional. I know what I do and I do this every day. So I have the ability to regulate my emotions better than a parent who is coming in. Um, the other thing that I try to remember is everybody involved is doing the best they can. Generally speaking, nobody's coming in trying to be difficult. Nobody's coming in because they don't like your child. I genuinely do not see teachers come in and say, I dislike this child. They might dislike, that the student's not completing the work. They're frustrated because they redirected them 10 times, and but they're there because they like children. I would also say to parents that generally you either have a facilitator for the meeting that's identified by their role in the meeting, or they come up naturally just because they have the gift of facilitation. And I would tell parents to allow them to do that, because this often involves asking clarifying questions, which I've seen parents, they're like, I've already told you that. But really, what it's there for when you're doing a facilitation is to get everybody on the same page. It's also to get people to understand where parents might be coming from. Like maybe they didn't know that something in this child's past is still impacting them. And so you ask those clarifying questions to have like a collective understanding. So, allow that facilitation to occur. It allows everybody to have that collective understanding, find commonalities and differences, and then build on those commonalities. And then it helps me as a facilitator identify the differences. So that's where I know, like, okay, this is where we're still hitting a roadblock. These are my items that we're going to work through today. Um, let me see. I would also say, remember at the end of it, it's always about the child. And, as a parent, I will always say, but this is about my child and what support she needs. I did have an unfortunate incident where someone had said that I was asking for extended time in order to get it on the SAT. And I said, I just need her to be functional at school. I don't care if she ever takes the SAT. Um, And so sometimes you have to remind them, like, no, it's about her and it's about this. It's not about like I'm trying to get something. So that's another thing to kind of remember or to bring the team back to. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
we're here to talk about Jimmy,
Right.
what's going to help Jimmy. And I find sometimes using the name or, you know, is this what's best for Jimmy? Does everybody agree that can be helpful? The other thing I would say for handling disagreements, I see some disagreements around parents' point of view versus the school's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Either the parents will say, but they don't act like this at home.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I try to explain they don't because it's a totally different environment. They've got peers here. They've got all these expectations of them. They have a lot of control, a lot of structure, where at home, we just generally don't.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes I'll see, teachers saying, I know you say they're anxious when they get home or they're crying when they get home. But when they're here, I see them talking with their friends all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we both have to kind of see each other's side and believe what the other person is saying and honor that input.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. What would be your thoughts on, because I've been in a meeting before where I got grumpy, like you mentioned earlier, I got a little grumpy. And, I just said, would it be okay if my husband and I went out in the hall for just a minute? And so we did that, and it felt kind of awkward to me asking it. But when I went back in and he and I re-entered the room, I did feel better. It's like we just kind of needed that minute to kind of reset. Is that would that
I,
be okay? Is that
I, I think that is one of the most underutilized techniques
Mhm.
um, because people have this tendency to want to plow through.
Mhm.
We're going to plow through. And And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you need a bit of a mental break, and
Right.
I think that is such a great strategy,
Mhm.
and it doesn't matter what you're talking about, it doesn't matter if it's a reset, it doesn't matter if you're conferring about, "Well, this is how I'm gonna say this," you know,
Mhm.
okay? Um, if you need that break, it is fantastic to ask for it,
Mhm.
and and as a school team member, I have never, it's never been a problem. It's like, yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
Please. So yes, school teams typically do not mind it.
Yeah. Well, because I felt a little awkward asking for it, but I felt better when I went back in. And so, I figured the net outcome was better, so that it was okay. It was
Well, what's funny, you can make it into kind of a funny thing if you are so inclined, if you weren't grumpy at the time. Teachers, educators, they do not get to use the restroom when they want to.
Mhm. Mhm.
So asking for a break and saying, and if y'all want to take a bathroom break, this might be a great time.
Right. I know
Uh,
it's your first one since 7 o'clock this morning. Right.
Right. So, and then that gives them time. They're like, hallelujah, let me run. I'll be right back.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you're also giving them a break too to reset, sit back down, feel a little bit more comfortable.
Mhm.
Uh, so it can be helpful for the school team as well.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, Lee, thank you so much for meeting with us today and talking through some of these things. I know that it can be tough, trying to figure out what do I need to do to prepare for a meeting and to make sure that everybody's working together, like you said, for Jim. Everybody's working together for that child. And so, thank you so much for sharing some strategies with us on how to do that. We really appreciate your expertise, your perspective, not only as a professional, but also as a parent. So thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me, and I hope that someone can find this helpful.
All right. Thanks, Lee. Bye bye.
If you have questions, Family Connection is here to help. You can call our Family Information Center at 800 578 888-878-8750 or visit our website www.familyconnectionsc.org.